In the heart of glamorous New York, a cold-hearted billionaire drops his wallet without even realizing it. But when a gravely ill homeless girl returns it, neither of them could have known that this fleeting moment would change their lives forever. What seemed like a brief encounter turns into a tearful, hopeful journey of redemption. New York City slipped into a radiant late afternoon, bathed in golden light, yet beneath its glamorous surface lay thousands of forgotten lives. The last rays of sunlight swept across glass buildings, reflecting like water, casting beams onto a line of expensive cars parked along the sidewalk. Polished shoes hurried into luxurious restaurants and hotels. The city pulsed ceaselessly, but amid its clamor, some people became invisible. Jonathan Whitmore, 47 years old, a nationally renowned investor, had just stepped out of the lobby of the Lucent, an icon of extravagance in the heart of Manhattan. He wore a meticulously tailored navy suit, a Patek Philippe watch glinting faintly beneath his sleeve, and an expressionless face all too familiar from the cover of Forbes. Every step he took was as precise as a Swiss watch, neither rushed nor slow, never hesitant. In his hand he checked his phone, a new email from a Singapore partner, a meeting in Zurich next week. He barely noticed when his glossy brown leather wallet slipped from his grip, falling onto the cobblestone pavement. The sound was so faint only the wind seemed to hear it. Across the street, a completely different world. Zoe Mitchell, 10 years old, sat quietly against a wall near the subway station. She huddled in an old faded pink hoodie, nearly white from wear, its sleeves dangling past her fingertips. Her gaunt face framed by large shadowed eyes, and her bald head gleamed under the streetlights. People often looked at her with unease, a fleeting glance, as if trying to erase her existence from their view. A small paper cup sat in front of her, holding just a few scattered coins after hours of waiting. Zoe didn't reach out to beg or plead with her voice. She simply sat there, as if silence was her only shield against further hurt. Inside her frail body raged a silent battle no one could see. Waves of pain like fire searing through her veins, a cancer, slowly tearing away her time. A chilly breeze swept through, carrying the scent of exhaust and roasted chestnuts. Zoe curled tighter, hugging her knees. She was used to the cold, the pain, and the way adults pulled their children away from her, as though she carried a curse. She looked up. Just as her eyes caught Jonathan's figure emerging from the hotel, he didn't see her. No one ever did. But this time, something stirred faintly within her, like a quiet background melody beginning to play, and then her gaze dropped. The leather wallet lay silently on the sidewalk. No one had noticed it yet. Zoe blinked. For a fleeting moment, a choice flickered in her mind. That choice, seemingly small, would become the starting point of everything. Zoe didn't think for long. Her small heart pounded as if it might burst from her chest, but her skinny legs sprang up, moving faster than her thoughts could catch up. The leather wallet lay there, luxurious, gleaming, capable of buying her dozens of meals or a few doses of painkillers she'd never dared to dream of. Yet she didn't bend down to keep it for herself. No. Her small hand reached out, trembling but resolute, picking up the wallet as if it were something more sacred than money. It was the choice to do the right thing. She saw the man preparing to step into a sleek black limousine with its door already open. The driver, an older man in a black suit, had his hand on the door, ready to close it. She knew if she didn't act now, that door would shut and he'd vanish from her world, like everyone else who'd ever walked past her life. "Sir, wait!" Her call was nearly swallowed by the city's clamor, lost among the honking horns and the hum of voices. No one heard. No one turned, so Zoe ran. Her tiny feet darted forward, weaving through the crowd like a faint shadow. She saw nothing but the car, heard nothing but her own heartbeat. Only seconds remained, and then she touched the hem of Jonathan's suit jacket. The world seemed to freeze. Jonathan spun around, his sharp blue eyes flashing with reflexive irritation. The driver immediately stepped forward to shield him, reacting as if protecting an important figure from something dangerous. But Zoe didn't flinch. She held up the wallet, breathless, yet her voice rang out with startling clarity. "You dropped this." Jonathan stared at her as if trying to unravel something illogical. He looked at the wallet, then at her, then at the tiny hands trembling from cold, exhaustion, and hunger. In that fleeting moment, his expression softened, not because of the wallet, but because of the person handing it to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but unfamiliar, as if he hadn't spoken those words in a long time. Zoe only nodded faintly, turning to leave, as if she expected nothing more than to fulfill her duty. But Jonathan stood still for a moment, his gaze no longer viewing the world as an investor, but as a human being. And somewhere deep in his chest, he felt something that had long ceased to exist. A faint stir, remarkably akin to compassion. The limousine glided silently away, leaving behind a thin wisp of exhaust, like a sigh amidst the city's heart. Jonathan Whitmore sat in the quiet cabin, his hands resting on the wallet that had just been returned to him, an object that wasn't particularly special, yet now felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. Outside, the streets streamed by like a faded film reel, but within him a single scene replayed endlessly. That gaunt face, those deep black eyes, and the small, trembling hand holding out the wallet she could have kept for herself without anyone knowing. Zoe. He didn't know her name yet, but her image had etched itself into his mind as if she were someone he'd met in a dream. A sorrowful dream. Jonathan wasn't a soft-hearted man. He was accustomed to a world of numbers, contracts, and faces that smiled on cue and lied as if it were second nature. But today, something had shifted off its usual axis. "Sir?" The voice of Robert, his driver and longtime assistant, broke the silence from the front seat. He rarely spoke unless necessary. Jonathan glanced at the rear-view mirror where Robert's eyes had been quietly observing his reaction since the wallet was returned. "What's the matter?" Jonathan asked softly, almost as if questioning himself. Robert paused briefly, then replied calmly, "Most people in her situation wouldn't have done that." Jonathan fell, silent. He knew that. He wouldn't have even blamed her if she'd kept the wallet. At that age, in this cold city, who still believed in kindness? And perhaps that was exactly why it unsettled him so deeply. "Stop the car," he said abruptly. Robert raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. The car pulled over to the curb, its tires squeaking faintly on the glossy asphalt. Jonathan slid the door open and stepped out. The evening breeze hit his face, carrying the smell of exhaust and the city. And in the distance, he saw her. Zoe was back at her spot, on the sidewalk near the subway station, her huddled posture unchanged. But this time, her head hung lower, her eyes no longer scanning the crowd with any hint of expectation, only staring down at her empty hands. He slowed his steps, and only when he stood a few paces away did she look up. She recognized him instantly. Her eyes widened slightly, not out of fear but surprise, because people like him didn't come back. They never did. "Did you forget something?" she asked quietly, her voice cautious. Jonathan nearly smiled, not because she was wrong, but because her question laid bare the deeper assumption within her, that she was just a passing breeze, a fleeting shadow he'd accidentally crossed paths with. "No," he said slowly, "but I think I might have overlooked something more important." She didn't understand. She didn't need to. He crouched down, pulled out the wallet, the very one she'd returned, and withdrew a few $100 bills. He placed them in the paper cup in front of her, as if setting down something sacred. Zoe started to protest. Her mouth opened, then closed. "It's not charity," Jonathan said quickly, reading the thought in her eyes. "It's for you to have a proper meal, and if possible, buy a warm enough coat." She lowered her head, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cup. "Thank you," he nodded, then asked, in a voice as soft as a passing breeze, "What's your name?" She looked up, hesitating. "Zoe." He repeated the name, as if holding onto something fragile. "Zoe. You're very brave." And the moment those words left his lips, Jonathan knew He couldn't walk away the same way anymore. The afternoon breeze grew colder as the sun dipped behind the gray skyscrapers. Jonathan stood silently before Zoe, while the crowd around them rushed on as if time never slowed for anyone, not even for a second. Zoe didn't say anything more. She simply bowed her head, her small hands clutching the edge of the paper cup as if it were her last anchor in an ocean of indifference. Jonathan was about to turn away. He wasn't sure if there was anything else he should do now, or if he'd already done enough, and then he saw it. Just a fleeting moment, but enough to make his world skip a beat. Her small shoulders trembled, not from the cold, but from a wave of dizziness. Zoe's eyes lost focus, drifting aimlessly. She raised a hand as if to grasp something, then suddenly collapsed. "Zoe!" Jonathan didn't recall how he shouted her name, only that his knees hit the ground at the same moment her tiny body fell. She was unconscious, her face terrifyingly pale. He fumbled to catch her, her frame so light it unnerved him, light enough to feel like she didn't belong to this reality but was merely a breath lost in the city. "Robert!" Jonathan yelled, his voice sharp with an urgency he'd never known. The driver bolted from the car. Without a word, he flung open the back door, and within a minute the limousine sped through traffic, leaving behind the blare of horns and flickering streetlights. But Jonathan didn't care. He held Zoe in his arms. She didn't respond. Her body burned with fever, her breath shallow and rapid, like a half-spent candle about to flicker out. He gently placed a hand on her forehead, unnaturally hot. A tiny hand was slipping away from reality. "Hold on, Zoe, hold on." His voice trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from fear, a feeling foreign to a man who always controlled everything. The car swerved into the emergency entrance of Midtown's largest hospital. As Jonathan burst out with Zoe in his arms, everyone outside turned to look. An influential man in an expensive suit cradling a frail little girl wasn't a common sight. "I need a doctor, now." His voice rang like an alarm bell. Nurses sprang into action. A stretcher was wheeled out, and Zoe was laid upon it. A young nurse asked hurriedly, "What's wrong with her?" "High fever, trouble breathing, collapsed on the street," Jonathan said rapidly. "She lives on the streets. Her name's Zoe." An older nurse stepped forward, her face stern yet gentle, blocking Jonathan as the team rushed Zoe inside. "Sir, we need space to work. Please wait out here." He stood frozen, his hands still warm from the fading heat of her body. The emergency room doors swung shut, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt utterly powerless. A man who had once manipulated markets, altered the fates of corporations with a single signature, was now just a man standing in a hospital corridor, unsure of what to do but wait. Robert approached, discreet but present. "I've informed accounting to cover all expenses," he said quietly. "No limit." Jonathan nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the white doors. In his mind, images flashed. Zoe's eyes as she returned his wallet, her huddled form on the sidewalk, her faint words nearly lost to the air. "I need help." Now he understood. Those weren't just passing words, they were a cry for help. The doors swung open. A doctor emerged, his face weary but professional. He looked at Jonathan, holding a clipboard. "You're the one who brought her in?" Jonathan nodded. "Her name's Zoe Mitchell," the doctor said, flipping through the file. "She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and has stage 3 skin cancer." The final sentence landed like a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile hope Jonathan had just begun to build. "She needs treatment immediately, and honestly," the doctor paused, "I don't know if it's already too late." Jonathan clenched his fists. No, he couldn't be as late as everyone else who'd abandoned her. Not this time. Jonathan had never liked hospitals. They always carried a scent quiet and bitter, the smell of things beyond control. But at this moment, he sat on a white plastic chair outside the emergency room like a stranger in his own life. On the wall hung a simple clock, its minute hand creeping along as if to prolong the torment. Robert sat silently a few chairs away, occasionally glancing at him, the man he'd served for nearly 2 decades. Now hunched slightly, hands clasped, looking no different from a father waiting for his daughter to emerge from danger. The doors swung open. A nurse stepped out, and seeing Jonathan leap to his feet, she gave a small nod. "She's awake, but very weak. You can go in, but please don't stay long." Jonathan didn't wait a second longer. The room was stark white, so quiet that the thudding of his heart seemed to echo off the walls. On the bed, Zoe lay tiny, like a drop of ink on a vast sheet of paper. Her face was pale, but her eyes, they were the same, alert, wary, and deep as an abyss. "You really came back," she whispered, the corner of her lips twitching upward. "I thought this was a dream." Jonathan sat on the chair beside her bed, his heart sinking at her words. A simple sentence, yet it carried the weight of countless times she'd been abandoned, overlooked, forgotten. "It's not a dream," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. You'll be okay." Zoe didn't respond. She just looked at him for a long time. That gaze made Jonathan feel as though she were peering through his suit, past his veneer of power, seeing a raw, vulnerable, and uncertain Jonathan. "Where do you live?" he asked softly. Zoe blinked. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she turned her head, gazing out the window as if afraid her answer might change his mind. "Hope Haven," she said quietly. "A shelter in the Bronx. It's not bad, but there's not enough medicine, and not enough people remember my name." That last part was like a small knife. Calm but razor sharp, Jonathan felt his throat tighten. He stood up. "Would you like to show me that place?" Zoe startled. "Now?" Jonathan nodded. "As soon as the doctor allows." 3 hours later, the sky had turned to dusk as the black limousine rolled north through the city. Through the tinted windows, towering buildings gradually gave way to shabbier neighborhoods, narrower streets, more cracked pavement, like a world quietly sinking that the rest of New York refused to see. Finally, the car stopped in front of an old building. A crooked sign reading Hope Haven hung above the entrance, its paint peeling, the windows clouded with the dust of time. Jonathan stepped out first, opening an umbrella to shield Zoe, then gently guiding her inside, step by step. The interior was warm but sparse. Children studied at old wooden tables. A few younger ones shared a piece of bread. A woman emerged from the kitchen, her gray hair tied up in a bun, wearing a worn apron, her eyes sharp. "Zoe Mitchell," she called out, her voice a mix of relief and reprimand. "What were you doing? No one could find you all day." Zoe bowed her head. "I'm sorry, Miss Grace." The woman glanced at Jonathan, pausing briefly. Her face betrayed clear wariness, but instead of introducing himself, Jonathan simply said, "I want to know how she lives here." Grace Thompson, the shelter's manager, studied him, silent for a long moment. "Then come in, but don't expect to like what you see." Jonathan stepped inside, and with each step on the worn tiles, a new beat pulsed in his chest. Every child's gaze that met his wasn't filled with hope, but with caution. And in that moment he knew it was time to do something, not just for Zoe, but for all the children. This world had forgotten. The next day, it rained. Not a roaring storm, but a steady, patient drizzle, cold as if the sky were shedding tears for something forgotten too long. Jonathan sat in his office, on the 72nd floor of a skyscraper, where floor-to-ceiling windows opened to a leaden gray sky, and everything was designed to exude power. A walnut desk, an expensive liquor cabinet, a world map dotted with red markers showing his controlling stakes. But this morning he wasn't looking at stock charts. He was staring at the paper cup, the one Zoe had placed in front of her yesterday. It was empty now, clean, but still bore its old, crumpled shape. Robert had retrieved it from Hope Haven and set it on his desk as a reminder. A child had sat for hours with this cup, hoping for a coin, while he and the entire city passed by as if she were a speck of dust, not worth mentioning. Jonathan picked up the phone and made 3 calls: a lawyer, a doctor, and an interior designer. The first week passed like a quiet storm. Jonathan returned to Hope Haven in person. He didn't bring the press or pose for photos. He just arrived, in a simple shirt with a direct gaze. Grace at first remained skeptical, but when she saw engineers measuring the foundation, architects inspecting the wiring, and doctors reviewing the children's medical files, she realized he wasn't there to save one child. He was there to rebuild an entire world. In just 3 weeks, everything changed. The rotting windows were replaced with clear, double-paned glass, letting real sunlight flood the shelter's hall for the first time. The walls were painted anew in soft yellow and mint green, colors recommended by a psychologist to help the children feel safe. A small library rose from an old storage room. Shelves brimmed with new books, each child's name handwritten and taped to the spines, so they knew these were theirs. The medical room was equipped with modern machines. A pediatrician was hired to visit weekly. For Zoe, a team of pediatric oncology specialists was arranged, providing treatment at a private hospital with a full regimen, chemotherapy, and psychological support. But the biggest change was the one no one saw right away. The children started laughing more. They ran out to the yard, now covered with real grass. Without fear of stepping on nails, they lined up to eat in a newly tiled dining room, free of mold and flickering lights. They began asking, "Is Uncle Jonathan coming today?" Because he didn't just come to pay. He came to read books, to listen, to look at each child with eyes not of pity, but of recognition. One late weekend afternoon, Zoe sat in a new armchair in the library corner, a book in hand. Her skin was still pale, but her cheeks held a hint of color. Her hair hadn't grown back, but her eyes now sparkled every time she saw Jonathan. He sat beside her, holding a different book. Neither spoke, just 2 people, worlds apart, sharing a peaceful space. "You know," Zoe said suddenly, not looking up from her page, "I used to think no one would come back. Everyone leaves, Mom, Dad, people who promised to help, my old teacher, even the governor." Jonathan looked at her, but didn't interrupt. Zoe turned to a new page, whispering as if to herself, "But you came back. A lot." One sentence, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of abandonment. Jonathan gently touched her hand, a touch lighter than a promise, but firmer than any contract he'd ever signed. "Because you deserve to see someone come back," he said. And more than that. Meanwhile, across the city, the media began to buzz. An anonymous billionaire had poured millions into an obscure children's shelter. No one knew why. No one had photos, just rumors. Jonathan didn't speak up. Because, for the first time in his life, it didn't matter if the whole world knew. It was enough that one child felt she mattered. One March evening, New York City was cloaked in a thin, silken mist. The lights from shopfronts spilled onto the damp streets, flickering like lost stars. In a small corner of the city, one few paid attention to Braznell. Hope Haven now glowed with a warm, golden light like an outstretched hand. Inside, an unusual stillness reigned. The children slept soundly, curled up in new blankets that smelled of clean fabric and carried the warmth of a recently installed heater. The patter of rain on the eaves mingled with the soft tick-tock of an old wooden clock, like the heartbeat of a home reborn. Jonathan sat in the common room on a velvet-upholstered armchair, an open book of fairy tales before him. Zoe lay beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, wrapped in a blanket, clutching a soft pillow shaped like a little fox. Her eyes were half closed, weary from a day of chemotherapy, but a dreamy smile lingered on her lips. "I like the part where the prince doesn't need to rescue the princess," she whispered. "She climbs out of the tower herself." Jonathan smiled faintly, gently turning to the next page. "But she doesn't go alone," he said. "She goes with someone who doesn't try to lead her, just walks beside her." Zoe didn't reply. She'd fallen asleep. her breathing steady, light as a breeze. Jonathan closed the book. He gazed at her sleeping form, long lashes, lips slightly parted, her face relaxed in a way that revealed something clear. Zoe was still just a child who'd had to grow up too soon. In that moment, he was no longer Jonathan Whitmore, the wealthy billionaire who once manipulated stocks and shifted markets. He was just a man, watching over a small life as she slept. He didn't know where this journey would take them. Zoe's illness remained an uncertainty, but one thing he knew for sure, from the moment she grabbed his hand in that crowd that day, he was no longer the same. And he didn't want to go back to being that man anymore. The next day, a small ceremony took place at Hope Haven. No press, no cameras, just the sound of a piano drifting from the corner, the children's laughter ringing out, and Grace standing by a cake table, tearfully saying thank you for giving the kids not just a place to live, but the belief that they're worthy of love. Jonathan stood at the back of the room, holding a mug of hot cocoa, quietly watching. When Zoe approached, wearing a pale blue dress, still in her knit cap, her eyes shining like tiny stars, he bent down and whispered, "You've changed my entire world." She smiled, a full, unguarded smile free of hesitation. For the first time in her life, that night, as Hope Haven settled into sleep, Jonathan didn't leave. He sat on the porch, a small umbrella propped beside him. The rain still fell quietly, just as it had the first time they met, and he knew, if time could rewind, if Zoe hadn't run after him that day, hadn't touched his hand, hadn't returned his wallet, he might still be the richest man in those towering buildings, but the emptiest. Now, he didn't just see Zoe, he saw the other children, the other Zoes, the small hands that needed to be held, not to be led but to be walked alongside. And he knew this was the true beginning.